I had camped in the El Dorado National Forest more times than I could count. My friends and I had our own little slice of it along Sopiago Springs, a spot we'd gone back to over and over because it felt hidden from the rest of the world. You had to know it was there to even find it. Tucked off a barely visible side trail, with the stream winding through a mix of pine and cedar. The air always smelled like sap and cold water, and at night the stars seemed so close you could touch them. That weekend was supposed to be different from our usual trips. Instead of bringing a bunch of food and coolers, we planned a 3-day foraging camp. The idea was to live off whatever we could gather, hunt, or fish with a few MREs as backup. We each brought a gun, minimal gear for shelter, and just enough supplies to get by. It was more about the challenge than comfort. The first night went about as well as you could hope. We set up camp right on the edge of the stream where the trees opened up just enough to let in sunlight during the day but still felt enclosed and private. My buddy managed to shoot a squirrel in the afternoon, and we pulled up a bucket of crawdads from under the rocks in the stream. We cooked them over the fire, ate until we were full, and washed it down with the few beers we'd packed in. The fire burned slow, the crickets chirped, and the night air was cool but not cold. I slept hard and without any dreams. The next morning, though, things felt different. I've been in the woods my whole life, and you learn to pay attention to the little changes. The way the air smells, how the birds sound, how the forest moves. That morning there was nothing. No wind in the trees, no rustling of small animals, no bird calls. Just a heavy stillness, like the whole forest was holding its breath. I've felt that before, usually when a predator is nearby, but this didn't feel like a bear or mountain lion. This felt like something was aware of me in a way that made the skin on the back of my neck tighten. One of the guys with me had been part of a few strange moments out there in the past. Things neither of us could fully explain, so when I saw him scanning the trees the same way I knew I wasn't imagining it. We didn't say much about it, but the mood was set for the day. We still went about the plan, checking the traps we'd set, looking for edible plants, but I kept finding myself looking over my shoulder. The silence was the kind that makes you feel too loud just walking. By the time night came, that uneasy feeling had settled deep in my gut. The guys decided to head a couple hundred yards up the stream to mess around with something. I think they were checking a snare or trying for more crawdads, and I stayed back at camp. Normally, I liked being alone in the woods, but that night was different. The longer I sat there, the more I felt like something was watching me from the darkness beyond the firelight. I threw on more wood until the fire roared high, lighting up the immediate area in a flickering orange glow. I kept my rifle across my lap, my hand resting on it. The other bad move we made was letting my friends take the only 2 flashlights. I didn't think much of it at the time, but in that kind of black forest darkness, firelight only goes so far. That's when I started hearing it, low, indistinct sounds coming from the trees opposite the direction my friends had gone. Not words exactly, but enough to know they were voices, faint and distant. They weren't panicked or hurried, just slow, like someone talking under their breath. The sound would stop, then start again, but never closer, never farther away. My ears strained to follow it, but it was too faint to make out anything real. I turned my eyes toward the tree-line, trying to let them adjust to the dark beyond the fire. That's when I caught a glimpse of movement, just a shape maybe 50 yards out. I brought the rifle up to my shoulder, peered through the scope, and caught sight of it for only a second. It was man-sized, but low to the ground, moving on all 4s. Its arms were long, too long, and it kept its body close to the ground in a way I've never seen a person do. The way it moved made the hair on my arms stand up. The shape paused, and even through the scope, lit only by the fire's edge, it was hard to make out details. Then it turned and loped deeper into the darkness, quiet as shadow. I stayed locked in that position for what felt like minutes after it disappeared, scanning back and forth. Then I started hearing small noises again. Light rustles, the sound of leaves shifting, the faint snap of a twig. They came from different points, never in the same spot twice, always somewhere in the half-circle of forest opposite the way my friends had gone. It was moving around me, keeping its distance but making sure I knew it was there. The fire was blazing by then, casting long, shifting shadows across the camp. Every movement in the tree-line caught my eye, but I never saw that shape again. My pulse was hammering in my ears, and I kept adjusting my grip on the rifle, ready for it to step into the open. About 10 minutes later, I heard my friends coming back along the stream. I could tell from their footsteps they were moving faster than usual. When they stepped into the light, their faces were tense, and they dropped whatever they'd been doing. I didn't even have to say anything. They could see how wound up I was, scanning the woods like a cornered animal. They didn't stick around to ask questions, and I didn't ask them anything right then either. We built the fire bigger than we ever had before and set up 3 separate spots where we could keep watch through the night. No one even tried to sleep. Every now and then, one of us would swear we heard something moving out there, but it never came close enough to see again. The darkness felt alive, pressing in around the edges of the fire's light. When the first thin light of morning finally hit the trees, it felt like a weight lifting. We didn't waste time. We packed up camp faster than I thought possible, barely speaking, just moving. My eyes kept going back to the tree-line, half expecting to see that shape watching from the shadows. But there was nothing, just the same stillness as before, like the forest was pretending nothing had happened. We hiked out without stopping, the only sound our boots on the dirt and the occasional crack of a branch underfoot. Nobody turned back to look. By the time we reached the truck, my shoulders ached from how tense I'd been. We drove away in silence for a long time, each of us staring straight ahead. We never went back to that spot again. It wasn't a decision we discussed, it was just understood. Whatever had been there that night hadn't been a bear, and it hadn't been a person. I don't know what it was, but I do know it was watching us, and it didn't want us there. That was enough. It was late summer, and our Boy Scout troop was deep in the Manistee National Forest on a multi-day backpacking trip. We had been hiking all day, carrying heavy packs through the thick, green woods. The sun had been out earlier, but by late afternoon the sky had turned gray, and a heavy stillness had settled over the forest. The air was damp and full of that earthy smell you only get deep in the woods, where the ground never fully dries. We had been miles from any road for most of the day, and by the time we set up camp, I couldn't hear anything except the distant rustling of leaves and the soft rush of a creek somewhere far away. We pitched our tents in a small clearing just off the trail. The ground was uneven in spots, covered in pine needles and soft moss, but it was the best place we'd seen for miles. Once camp was set, we ate dinner over the small camp stoves, the warm food steaming in the cool air. As the sun went down, the forest turned dark fast. Without the moon up yet, the blackness between the trees felt heavy, almost solid. The tall pines swayed slightly, and every so often, a branch cracked somewhere far off. By the time we zipped ourselves into our sleeping bags, the camp was quiet except for the occasional whisper of someone shifting in their tent. I remember lying there in the darkness, trying to get comfortable on my thin sleeping pad, the fabric of my sleeping bag swishing every time I moved. My ears picked up every faint sound outside, the soft clicking of insects, the sigh of wind through the treetops. I must have dozed off for a short while before the noises started. It began as a long, high-pitched wail, so sharp and sudden it jolted me awake. For a second I thought I was dreaming, but then it came again, even louder. It wasn't like a coyote howl I'd heard before. It was shriller, with a kind of ragged edge to it, like something was in pain or enraged. My heart was pounding before I'd even sat up. I held my breath, straining to listen. Then, from a different direction, another sound answered it, shorter, more like a screech than a howl. My stomach tightened. Whatever was making those sounds, there were at least 2 of them, maybe more. The noises echoed in the forest, bouncing between the trees, so it was hard to tell exactly how far away they were. Every so often, a deeper, almost growling tone would cut through, followed by silence. Then another burst of that horrible, human-like screaming. I lay there completely still, my ears wide open. I could hear movement too, heavy, quick rustling through the underbrush, like something running. At one point, the sound stopped, and the forest went dead quiet for a few seconds. Then came a deep, hollow thwack, loud enough to make me flinch. It sounded exactly like a baseball bat hitting a solid wooden post. Pause, then another hit, then again. Whatever it was close enough for me to feel the dull vibration through the ground. This went on for what felt like hours. The high-pitched screams and shrieks would come in bursts, sometimes from far away, sometimes close enough to make my skin crawl. Every so often there would be that violent strike against wood, always in pairs or threes, always with a pause in between. I could hear someone in a nearby tent shifting around, but no one said a word. I pulled my sleeping bag tighter around me and stared into the blackness above, just waiting for it to stop. Eventually, the noises faded. I don't remember falling asleep. I just remember waking up to the gray light of morning, my body stiff and sore from barely moving all night. The forest looked calm again, birds chirping, the air cool and still. Everyone went about packing up camp like normal, no one saying much about the night. I kept glancing around at the tree line, looking for any sign of what we'd heard. Broken branches, footprints, anything, but there was nothing obvious. We got back on the trail and hiked for hours through the rolling terrain, our boots crunching on the sandy soil. The forest here was dense in places, the trail winding between thick stands of pine and hardwood. At one point, a lone hiker appeared coming toward us from the opposite direction. He was tall, wearing a sun-faded cap and a big pack. As we passed each other, he slowed down, his eyes narrowing slightly as he looked over our group. He asked if we'd been making noise last night. Not just noise. He said there had been screaming, yelling, and banging on trees, and that it had gone on for hours. He said it had kept him awake most of the night, even though he'd been camped far from where we were now. He'd even called out into the dark for whoever it was to stop, but it hadn't made a difference. Our scoutmaster told him it hadn't been us, and the man just frowned, muttered something under his breath, and kept walking. That night stuck with me for years. I didn't talk about it much, but the memory never really faded. I'd heard coyotes plenty of times since then, and nothing about that night matched what they sound like. I thought maybe it was some strange animal, maybe more than one, but the banging on wood didn't make sense. Years later, out of curiosity, I was watching videos online of odd wildlife sounds from different forests. In the recommended list was a video titled something about strange noises in the Manistee National Forest. I clicked it, and my stomach dropped almost immediately. The audio was grainy, recorded from far off, but it was the same. Those same piercing screams, ragged and uneven, echoing through the trees. And faintly, in the background, you could hear the deep, solid thwack of wood striking wood. The description said it had been recorded by a camper who had been several miles into the forest. The date wasn't the same as our trip, but the location was close. Hearing that again after all those years made something click for me. Whatever we'd heard wasn't just a random animal sound. Other people had heard it too, far away from where we'd been. I still don't know exactly what it was. Maybe some territorial animal I've never read about, maybe even people out there in the dark doing something they didn't want to be seen doing. But I do know this, it wasn't coyotes. That trip taught me something that stayed with me on every hike and campout since. There are things in the woods you can't explain right away, and you don't always get the answer later. Out there, miles from anywhere, you're in someone or something else's territory, and you might never know what's moving just beyond your sight. Every time I go into the backcountry now, no matter how prepared I am, I remember those screams in the dark and the sound of something slamming into wood over and over again. It's the kind of thing you don't forget, and it's why I keep one ear open at night, even when the forest seems calm. I remember that weekend like it happened yesterday. It was in the fall, maybe late October, when the air was sharp and damp, and the leaves had already fallen into a thick, wet carpet across the ground. Our Boy Scout troop had taken a trip up to Indian Mound Reservation in Wisconsin. Everyone called it IMR, and it had a certain weight to the name. The place was surrounded by tall trees, the kind that blocked out most of the sunlight once you got into the deeper trails, and scattered around the area were the burial mounds, low, grassy humps that looked like small berms at a gun range. They didn't look like much at first, but you knew they were old. You could feel it when you stood near them. We set up camp in the late afternoon, a cluster of canvas tents spaced just far enough apart so you could still hear your friends' voices if they talked loud, but far enough that when you were in your tent at night, it felt like you were alone. The ground was cold, soft in spots from recent rain, and covered with wet leaves that stuck to the bottom of your boots. I remember my fingers getting numb just from hammering the stakes in, the kind of chill that seeps into you no matter how many layers you wear. That night, after dinner by the fire, the air seemed heavier. The smoke from the fire clung to our clothes and hair. You could hear the slow creak of branches overhead when the wind moved through. The rest of the troop laughed and told stories, their voices rising and falling with the firelight, but I turned in early. My tent was small, just big enough for me, my sleeping bag, and my pack. Once I zipped the flap shut, the only light came from the faint orange glow of the fire outside, fading fast as I settled in. I fell asleep to the muffled sound of voices, the occasional pop from the fire, and the faint rustle of the wind through the trees. Sometime later, I couldn't say how long, I woke up. It wasn't sudden, like from a nightmare. It was slow, like my mind had picked up on something before I could even place what it was. The air in the tent felt colder than when I'd fallen asleep. My ears tuned in first, not my eyes. There was a sound just outside my tent. At first, it was faint, like something dragging through the wet leaves. Not a dry crunch, more of a soft, damp shuffle. Then it came again. 2 steps. A pause. Another 2 steps. I lay completely still, my hands tucked inside the sleeping bag, eyes open but fixed on the inside wall of the tent. The footsteps moved around the side, slow, deliberate, dragging just enough to push the wet leaves aside. I could hear each step clearly. It circled halfway around, then stopped right near the front of my tent. No movement, just stillness. I stared at the faint outline of the zipper, my breath caught in my throat. The pause stretched long enough that I started to wonder if maybe whoever it was had crouched down. Then, just as slowly, the footsteps started again, this time in the other direction, circling back around. The sound faded a little as it moved toward the back, then came closer again as it reached the front. The same pattern: stop, wait, turn, walk the other way. I didn't move. I didn't call out. My mind told me that if I unzipped that flap and looked out, whatever I saw or didn't see would be worse than just lying there listening. I followed the sound with my ears, my head turning slightly inside my sleeping bag without me realizing it. Every tiny movement felt loud inside the tent. It went on for what felt like minutes, though it could have been less. Then, as suddenly as it started, the sound stopped. No footsteps, no dragging, just silence, except for the occasional drip of water from a tree branch outside. I stayed awake for a long time after, staring at the wall of the tent, listening for anything else. Eventually, I must have drifted back to sleep. The next morning, everything looked normal. The ground outside was scattered with leaves like before, but I didn't see any obvious footprints. It had rained lightly overnight, so any prints might have been washed out. I didn't say anything to anyone. It wasn't the kind of thing you could explain without it sounding like you'd imagined it. That second night, I couldn't relax. I crawled into my sleeping bag and zipped it all the way up except for a small opening for air. My ears stayed sharp, waiting for the sound to come back. Hours passed with only the occasional rustle of leaves from the wind, a distant owl, the normal nighttime sounds. But every time I closed my eyes, my mind replayed the night before. The 2-step walk, the pause, the turn, the slow drag through damp leaves. I slept light, waking at every small noise. I thought I heard something at one point, but it was quick, like a branch falling or a squirrel moving through the underbrush. Nothing like the slow, steady movement from before. By morning, I felt drained, like I'd been on watch all night instead of sleeping. When we packed up on the last day, I kept glancing toward the tree line around camp. The burial mounds stood quiet in the distance, their shapes blending into the ground unless you knew where to look. As we loaded the gear into the trucks, I walked past the spot where my tent had been. The leaves looked undisturbed, but I knew what I'd heard that first night. It wasn't a ghost story. I didn't see anything, didn't feel some icy hand or hear whispers. But there's a difference between the random noise of the woods and the deliberate pattern of someone or something walking a circle around your tent in the dark, pausing at the door, then going the other way. That first night at IMR left me with that difference burned into my head. And ever since then, whenever I'm camping, no matter how far from town or how deep into the trees, I sleep light. I listen for the sound of 2 slow steps, the pause, the turn, and the drag of damp leaves moving aside in the dark. We had gone into Ocala National Forest earlier that afternoon, planning to hunt wild hogs until late. The air was thick and damp like it always is in that part of Florida, the kind that sticks to your skin and makes the trees feel closer than they really are. The forest, there is a mix of pine, oak, and palmetto, with patches of standing water hidden in the undergrowth. Even in daylight, it's easy to get turned around if you aren't paying attention, but we had GPS, compasses, and our rifles. We weren't worried about much of anything. By the time the sun set, we were deep inside, probably 3 or 4 miles from the nearest dirt road, farther than we had meant to go. We had been tracking sign, looking for rooting patches, but the hogs had kept moving ahead of us. Around midnight, we realized we'd stayed out longer than planned. The forest had settled into that strange, heavy silence it gets at night, the kind that makes every little sound stand out. We were both heavily armed, AR-15s with mounted lights, sidearms on our hips, and fixed-blade knives in sheaths. I carried a large flashlight in my hand, one of those with a wide, bright beam that could also strobe. It was solid enough to use as a club if it came to it. Between the weapons, the gear, and the clear night sky, we didn't feel any real danger. The moon was bright enough that even under the canopy we could navigate without much trouble. The trail we were on wasn't really a trail anymore, more like an old logging road being reclaimed by the woods. The ground was soft from weeks of rain, and the air smelled of wet pine needles and moss. The trees formed tight walls on either side, their shadows stretching out across the narrow track ahead. We had maybe an hour's walk left to reach the car, and we kept a steady pace. That's when we heard it. Off to our right, something big was moving through the brush. Fast. The sound was loud enough to cut through everything else. Leaves snapping, undergrowth crashing, the sharp crack of small branches breaking. Whatever it was coming in at an angle that would cross the trail ahead of us. My first thought was a deer. Second thought was a black bear. Either way, it didn't matter, we weren't going to shoot it at night. We stopped and waited, rifles angled down, listening to it come closer. The forest quadrant we were in was bordered by another overgrown trail up ahead, maybe 50 feet in front of us. I kept the rifle light off and used my handheld instead, not wanting to blind either of us with the mounted beams. As soon as the crashing reached the edge of the trail, I clicked the flashlight on. The beam lit up the narrow track ahead. For a second, I saw nothing but thin palmetto fronds and the pale sand of the path. Then a pair of legs crossed in front of us, bare from the knee down, skin pale against the dark brush. They were human legs, white, bare, moving quick, and then they were gone, swallowed up by the blackness on the other side. I stood there, light still aimed at the spot, trying to make sense of it. No flashlight, no sound of talking, just someone running full tilt through deep woods at 1 in the morning wearing shorts. The brush out there was thick and unforgiving. Palmettos and briars will cut you up in minutes. And this person wasn't even on the trail. We looked at each other, both thinking the same thing. What kind of person does that out here? It didn't make sense. But turning back would have meant an extra 30 minutes of walking around that forest quadrant, and we weren't in the mood for that. We pushed on. Every so often, we'd hear movement again, distant crashes in the brush, like whatever it was had shifted position but was staying away. Not close enough to shine a light on, not close enough to get a real look, but it was there. The closer we got to the road, the more I felt the tension ease. My focus shifted from the tree line to the thought of my car sitting alone on the side of the dirt road. When we finally stepped out of the trail and saw it, parked exactly where I'd left it, I felt relief flood in. No broken windows, no signs anyone had messed with it. We kept the rifles loaded, holstered our sidearms between the seat and center console, and climbed in. The moonroof was open, letting in the smell of pine and the distant sound of frogs and insects. The drive out of that forest was always one of my favorite parts. Just dirt road, trees, and stars bright enough to make you forget the rest of the world existed. We had gone maybe half a mile when the headlights cut through the dark and picked up a shape ahead. A man. He was walking right down the middle of the dirt road toward us. He wore a checkered button-down shirt and shorts. No backpack, no flashlight, no gear of any kind. His arms hung loose at his sides, his head straight ahead, eyes fixed somewhere past us. We were miles from any paved road, and from there it would still be another 10 miles to get to the nearest gas station or small town. The northern part of Ocala doesn't have cabins or private property. It's protected land. There was nowhere nearby for him to have come from. As we passed, he didn't turn his head, didn't glance at the car, didn't break stride, just kept walking, the taillights catching him for a second before the road bent and he vanished behind us. Neither of us said anything for a while. The forest outside the car felt heavier somehow, darker. The image of those bare legs flashing across the trail kept coming back. Was it him? Had he been cutting through the woods in the middle of the night for no reason we could understand? Or was there someone else out there entirely, moving parallel to us in the dark? We reached the paved road without seeing him again. The rifles went into the trunk, bolts cleared, magazines out. We didn't stop anywhere on the way home. Even now, I can't explain it. Maybe it was just some guy who knew the forest better than we did. Maybe he lived off-grid. Maybe he was high on something. I don't know. What I do know is that the middle of Ocala National Forest isn't a place you stumble into by accident at 2 in the morning without light, water, or supplies. Whatever he was doing out there, it wasn't normal. And that night made it clear. No matter how many times I go back, I'll never step foot in that forest without being armed and ready. Some of the strangest, most unsettling things you'll ever see happen far away from anyone who could explain them. And once you've been out there, you understand exactly how easy it is to disappear into those woods and never be found. We had set up camp in a public campground deep in the woods, a spot with maybe 15 or so campsites scattered around a loop. The place wasn't crowded that weekend, maybe 5 other groups were there, but you could still feel the space between each site. Ours was at the far end of the loop, tucked near the tree line, with only one neighboring site close enough to see through the gaps in the branches. Beyond that, there were empty campsites, some with old fire rings filled with ash, picnic tables covered in pine needles, and paths that had been worn into the dirt years ago but were now slowly being reclaimed by weeds. It was late October, just cold enough at night to make you want to huddle near the fire, but not so cold that it was unbearable. The air had that sharp, clean smell that only comes when the leaves have just finished turning. By the time the sun went down, the woods turned into a wall of black. The moon wasn't out, so without a flashlight, you couldn't see more than a few feet in front of your face. Around 10 that night, I felt my stomach start to cramp. I knew what that meant. The campground had proper restrooms with running water, but they were a good quarter-mile from our site. I grabbed my flashlight, told the guys I'd be back in a few minutes, and headed down the gravel path toward the bathrooms. The path wound past 2 empty campsites before connecting to the main loop road. As I got closer to one of the unused sites, my beam caught movement. Someone stepping out from a narrow trail between the trees and onto the main path. The trail they came from wasn't the one that led from our campsite. It was a side path that cut through a patch of dark woods to an abandoned site maybe 50 yards from where our tent area was. I recognized the walk immediately. My friend, Dan, had this weird, unmistakable gait, like one of his legs was just a little stiff. Even from 40 feet away, it was obvious it was him. He was ahead of me, walking in the same direction toward the bathrooms. At a couple of points, he half-turned, his body silhouetted in my flashlight's edge, and his head tilted just enough that I could tell he was looking back. I didn't think much of it at first, just figured he'd taken some weird shortcut for whatever reason. The distance between us stayed about the same the whole way. Every time I thought I might catch up, he picked up his pace just enough to keep the gap. Then, right before the bathrooms came into view, he rounded a bend in the path. When I followed seconds later, the path was empty. No one ahead of me. Inside the restrooms, the stalls were all empty. I used one, took my time, and half expected him to be washing his hands or lingering by the sinks when I came out. But there was no one there. I stepped outside and scanned the darkness with my flashlight. Nothing. By the time I got back to camp, I was ready to mess with him for sneaking off. The fire was still going, and everyone was sitting exactly where I'd left them, including Dan. He was leaning back in his chair, drink in hand, talking to one of the other guys. When I asked why he'd taken that weird path through the woods and vanished before the bathrooms, they all looked at me like I'd lost it. Dan swore he hadn't moved from the fire the whole time. I let it go, thinking they were just messing with me, but it stuck in my head. I knew what I'd seen. Around 3 in the morning, I woke up again, this time with my bladder full. I didn't feel like walking all the way to the restrooms, so I slipped out of my sleeping bag, unzipped the tent, and stepped quietly into the cold night. The campfire was nothing but a few glowing embers. I walked a short way into the woods behind our site, did my business, and started heading back. The air was still. No wind, no sounds except for my own footsteps. As I got closer to the tents, I heard the quiet rip of a zipper being pulled open. It was coming from Dan's tent. The faint outline of the door flap moved, and I heard the zipper go back up. Then I saw him, the same build, same height, same posture, standing just outside the tent. He moved a few steps away, flicked his lighter, the sparks lighting up his face in brief flashes. I could see him clearly when the lighter caught. He lit a cigarette, took a slow drag, and blew smoke into the dark. He walked toward the cars parked near the entrance of our site, about 30 feet ahead of me. I followed, thinking maybe I'd finally figure out what game he was playing. As soon as he passed behind one of the cars, he disappeared from view. I rounded the car a second later, shining my flashlight around. Nothing. The space was empty, just gravel and cold air. I stood there for a minute, waiting for him to pop out from behind something, but the whole area was dead quiet. Frustrated, I turned back toward camp. Dan's tent was zipped shut, the door flap sealed. From inside, I could hear the low, steady rhythm of him snoring. I crouched down near the tent, listening for a while, trying to catch any sign that he'd just climbed back in. But the breathing never broke. It was the deep, even kind you only hear when someone's been asleep for a while. I sat by the fire pit for a bit, the cold starting to seep in through my sweatshirt, and kept glancing toward the tents. I didn't wake anyone else up. I didn't even mention it the next morning. The thing is, I wasn't drunk enough to imagine what I saw. I'd had a couple of beers earlier, sure, but I remember every step of it. The way his shoulders hunched when he walked, the way his head tilted when he lit the cigarette. All of it was exactly like him. But both times that night, when I'd gotten back to camp, he'd been in his tent. I never heard him unzip it to get out or back in, never saw him cross the site. I can explain away a lot of things. Maybe someone else in the campground had a walk like his. Maybe there was another guy with the same build, same kind of jacket. But both times, from different directions, at that time of night, in a half-empty campground, the part that sticks with me most isn't just seeing him. It's how both times he stayed far enough ahead that I never caught up. Like he knew exactly how fast to walk to keep me following, but not close enough to reach him. Like it wasn't about going anywhere, it was about leading me just far enough into the dark before disappearing. I don't believe in anything supernatural, so I've never told this story as a ghost thing. But I still don't have a normal explanation. All I know is if I'm camping and I see someone in the dark who moves like a friend of mine, I'm not following them anymore. It was Wednesday, August 3rd, 2016, at exactly 1:40 in the afternoon when I pulled up to the entrance of the Vicksburg National Military Park in Mississippi. The sun was high, glaring down in that heavy southern way that makes the air feel thicker than it should. I had driven into town earlier that day, checked into my hotel, and decided that before the day slipped away, I wanted to see the battlefield I had read about so many times in books. It wasn't my first trip to a historical site, but there was something about Vicksburg that I had always found fascinating. The siege, the trenches, the sheer weight of what happened there. I paid the $12 entry fee and slowly drove through the main gates. Immediately, the scenery shifted. The noise of the town disappeared behind me, replaced by long, curving roads lined with monuments, plaques, and memorial stones. Every few hundred feet there was something. Granite blocks etched with regimental names, weathered statues of soldiers standing at attention, brass plaques listing ranks and dates. Some had flowers placed at their bases, sun-bleached and brittle from sitting out in the heat. The grass was trimmed short, but the trees on either side cast long, restless shadows across the road. I was behind what had once been Union lines. The signs made that clear. I kept the car moving slowly, not just to take in the details, but because something about the place made me feel like I shouldn't rush. It wasn't a loud or obvious feeling, just a quiet awareness, like the air here still remembered. After a while, I came up on one of the old Civil War cannons positioned right near the edge of the road. It sat just outside a thicket of trees and brush, its barrel aimed across an open stretch toward where the Confederate positions had been more than 150 years ago. The green paint on the cannon wheels was chipped, and the metal of the barrel looked pitted, the kind of texture that comes from long exposure to rain and sun. I pulled my car to the side and stepped out. The air was hotter once I was standing still. The cicadas were loud, a high, steady buzz that seemed to come from everywhere at once. I could smell the dry grass and something faintly metallic from the cannon itself. I had my camera in my backpack, and I pulled it out, wiping the lens with my shirt before powering it on. I walked slowly around the cannon, crouching slightly to get a better angle. I took a few shots, close-ups of the barrel, the wheels, the plaque that gave details about the unit that had manned it. My shoes crunched against the gravel shoulder of the road, and the heat made the back of my neck sweat. As I adjusted the focus to take another photo, I glanced up toward the thicket of trees directly behind the cannon. That's when I froze. At first, I didn't fully register what I was looking at. There was a figure standing just inside the tree line, maybe 10 or 15 yards away. My first thought was that it was a reenactor or a park worker in period clothing. He wore a blue coat, long-sleeved, with brass buttons that caught little flecks of sunlight coming through the leaves. A dark slouch hat was pulled low over his brow. His hands were holding a long rifle, the butt resting lightly against the ground. The thing that stopped me wasn't his clothing, it was how still he was. He wasn't looking at me, not exactly. His gaze seemed fixed past me, over my shoulder toward something else entirely. His face had no expression, no sign that he had noticed me at all. Something about it didn't make sense. The park wasn't holding any events that day. I had checked before coming. There was no crowd, no reenactments, just scattered visitors driving the loop. The spot where he stood wasn't on a trail. The brush there was thick enough that you couldn't just wander in without making noise. I didn't remember hearing anyone walk up, and there had been no movement in the trees before I saw him. I shifted my weight, taking a half step toward the cannon to try to get a better view. My camera was still in my hand, but I didn't raise it. The air around me suddenly felt warmer, heavier. I blinked, and in that split second, the figure was no longer there. It was as if I had looked away for a moment and the space he'd occupied was now just empty. Only the tangled green and brown of the undergrowth, dappled with sunlight. My eyes darted around, scanning the edges of the trees, searching for any sign of movement. Nothing. No crunch of leaves, no retreating footsteps, not even the faintest sway of branches. I stood there for what felt like several minutes, my camera hanging loosely at my side. My breathing had changed without me realizing. Slow, controlled, but deeper than normal. The noise of the cicadas was still there, but now it sounded sharper, like it was pressing in closer to me. It wasn't fear in the movie sense. It was something else. My mind kept trying to piece it together. Maybe it was just another visitor. Maybe he stepped back and I couldn't see him anymore. But the more I replayed it in my head, the more I realized that I had seen every detail of him clearly just moments before, and then he was simply gone. There was no place for him to have disappeared to without me hearing or seeing some sign of it. I walked slowly toward the tree line, stopping a few feet short. The undergrowth was dense, low shrubs, vines, and fallen branches. If anyone had moved through it, it would have been obvious. I didn't hear anything except my own breathing and the constant summer drone of insects. After standing there a bit longer, I turned and walked back to my car. I didn't rush, but every step felt deliberate, like I didn't want to turn my back on that spot too quickly. I placed my camera on the passenger seat, started the engine, and eased back onto the park road. For the rest of the drive, I found myself glancing into the trees more often than before, scanning for any sign of movement. I stopped at a few more markers, but the feeling from that moment stayed with me, sitting heavy in my chest. By the time I exited the park, the sun was beginning to slide lower in the sky, the heat slowly letting go of the ground. Back in my hotel room that night, I kept replaying the scene in my head. I thought about writing it down right away, not because I believed it was something supernatural, but because I didn't want to forget a single detail. The angle of the light, the texture of his coat, the way he held the rifle. All of it felt etched into my mind, but I knew memory fades. The truth was, I couldn't explain it in any way that made full sense. I had seen a man who shouldn't have been there, in a place that made disappearing without a trace almost impossible. Maybe there was an explanation I wasn't thinking of. A worker in period clothing who stepped away quietly, a visitor who somehow moved without a sound. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized that it didn't matter if I could explain it or not. What mattered was how that single, quiet moment had shifted the way I saw the battlefield. It wasn't just history carved into stone and cast in bronze. It was a place that still carried the weight of everything that had happened there, in a way you could feel without ever touching it. I left Vicksburg the next morning, but the memory of that still, silent figure has never left me. Every time I think back to that hot afternoon in August, I can still see the blue coat, the brass buttons catching the light, and the empty space that was left behind when he was gone. I had been planning this solo trip for months. The Mogollon Rim in Arizona had always fascinated me, not for its usual desert landscape, but for the high-elevation forests that looked nothing like the Arizona most people imagined. At around 7,500 feet, the air is damp, the ground is thick with ferns, and the trees form a dense canopy that feels more like the Pacific Northwest than the Southwest. It's remote country, the kind of place you can hike for days and never see another soul. I wanted that kind of isolation. When I parked my truck at the trailhead, I didn't see another vehicle. The trail was overgrown, the air heavy with the smell of wet earth and pine needles. I carried everything I needed: tent, sleeping bag, some MREs for backup, and my satellite communicator so I could check in with family each night. As I hiked deeper, the quiet started to sink in. There were no bird calls, no wind moving through the trees, no buzzing insects. Just my boots crunching through wet leaf litter and the occasional creak of my pack straps. At one point, I passed an old, collapsed shack half hidden in the brush. A few yards away, I saw plastic irrigation tubing coiled and brittle with age, signs of old pot grows. I'd read that in these remote areas, illegal growers sometimes set up in the forest. Most were abandoned years ago, but I knew it was dangerous to stumble into an active one. I was relieved these looked long and used, the wood rotting, the tubing cracked, no fresh signs of people. By late afternoon, I found a spot that seemed almost perfect. It was a flat bench of ground about the size of a big living room, perched above a narrow creek. Behind the bench was a steep, brush-covered cliff that you couldn't climb without breaking branches and knocking rocks loose. In front, a sheer drop-off led to the creek below, the bank undercut from past floods. The only way up was a steep, narrow game trail that wound through thick brush. Anyone coming up would have to make noise. I set my tent toward the back, near the cliff wall, so nothing could approach me from behind. The view over the creek was blocked by vegetation, but I could hear the faint trickle of water. It was overcast, and by the time I got camp set up, the light was fading. I tried sending a check-in on my satellite communicator, but the tree canopy was so thick it took several attempts before the message went through. As the sun set, the silence became even heavier. It was the kind of quiet where you notice the smallest sounds, the rustle of your sleeping bag, the creak of nylon as your tent shifts in the breeze. The air felt damp and cool, and without moonlight, The darkness was absolute. My headlamp barely seemed to cut it. I cooked a quick dinner, ate inside my tent, and listened to nothing but the faint creak below. Not a single frog, no crickets, no night birds. The kind of silence that makes your own breathing sound loud. I crawled into my sleeping bag and tried to sleep, but my ears kept straining for sounds. I could hear my heartbeat in my ears. Sometime after midnight, I was jolted awake by a sudden, intense white light flooding my tent. It wasn't a flicker, it was bright and steady, and it lit up the thin fabric walls so completely that I could see the outline of my gear inside. My first thought was a human visitor, maybe someone out here for reasons I didn't want to find out. I scrambled for my flashlight and unzipped the tent, pushing myself halfway out. The instant the zipper opened, the light was gone, just pitch black forest again. The creek still trickled faintly, but otherwise, the silence was untouched. I stayed still for a moment, listening hard. No footsteps, no movement through the brush. If someone had come up that steep game trail, I would have heard it. My flashlight was a high-powered one, and I swept it in slow arcs through the trees. Nothing, just black trunks, tangled branches, and the dull silver of wet leaves. Then, out in the distance between the trees, I saw something faint, a glow. Not like a flashlight beam, there was no sharp focus, no bobbing like someone walking. It was diffuse, like the faint reflection of light off mist, but there was no mist in the air. It flickered slightly, almost like it was being filtered through moving leaves. It lasted maybe a minute, then faded completely. I stood there for a while, breathing slow, forcing myself to listen. Nothing, not a twig snap, not even the distant sound of an animal moving. Just that same low trickle of water far below me. I ducked back into the tent but didn't lie down. I sat cross-legged with my flashlight in hand, every few minutes turning it off to listen in complete darkness. My eyes adjusted, but the night was so black it made no difference. Hours passed like that, with nothing else happening. The air felt heavier than before, like the stillness was pressing in. When first light started to seep into the forest, it didn't feel like morning. The sky was pale, but the forest was still dark under the thick canopy. The dawn chorus I expected, the birds starting up as soon as the sun touched the treetops, never came. No birds at all, no insects, just that same constant trickle of the creek. I stepped out of the tent and checked the ground around the bench. The soil was soft and would have shown prints if anyone had been there. There were none. No broken branches on the trail leading up, no disturbed leaves, no sign of movement. It was as if nothing had happened at all. I boiled water for coffee, standing there with the steam curling up in front of my face, and realized I didn't want to stay another night. That bench, which had seemed so secure, now felt wrong in a way I couldn't quite name. It wasn't fear of someone finding me. It was the silence, that unnatural, absolute quiet that had never broken the entire time I'd been there. By the time I packed my gear, the light was stronger, but the forest still gave nothing back. No chirps, no rustles, no movement except my own. I hiked out, the brush dragging at my pack, the trail slick with damp leaves. When I finally reached my truck hours later, the relief was physical, like my lungs could fill properly again. I've camped in a lot of remote places since then, but I've never gone back to that spot. I know I could find it if I tried, but I won't. There's something about being in a place where life should be all around you. Birds, insects, animals, and it's just not there. It's not the kind of thing you forget. That bench above the creek is still up there somewhere, but it can stay empty. I don't need to see it again.